OneAcademy is the heart of our company. Cryptocurrency is not an easy product. It's a very innovative product based on technology and based on very, very complex concepts. For us to be part of this financial revolution, to be part of cryptocurrency and of a community, we need to understand exactly what we do and what we talk about. And this is why we have the OneAcademy. The OneAcademy provides you with concepts, provides you with explanation on cryptocurrency and on the financial world. I would encourage everybody to join the courses, to do the certificates, and to understand thoroughly how to use cryptocurrency, what cryptocurrency is, and how we can change the world by using cryptocurrency. OneAcademy. Learn today, lead tomorrow.
Greetings and good day to everyone from the Caribbean and the rest of the world. Welcome to our OneAcademy Zoom call 2020. We certainly appreciate you being with us today. My name is Sherry-Ann Charles Patterson, and I am your host today from the beautiful island of Trinidad and Tobago. With a reminder of why we are here, our founder, Dr. Ruja Ignatova, has said that we learn today so we can lead tomorrow. What is OneAcademy? OneAcademy is an innovative e-learning platform covering a broad range of topics, including financial areas such as financial analysis, asset management, Forex, the stock exchange, cryptocurrency, and more. Our mission is to provide our students with the guidance and educational materials needed to achieve financial literacy. OneAcademy was developed by finance experts and academics. It is highly structured and easy to understand. You learn at your own pace and can be part of the future of global finance reset. Our intention is to give you a unique sense of understanding and facts which you can use to enhance your knowledge and daily lives, as well as promote our core product, OneAcademy, and the benefits of our ecosystem. I encourage you today to take copious notes to assist you in your quest to become certified, knowledgeable, and wise business leaders and money managers. Well, it is a beautiful Monday here in Trinidad and Tobago, and we are ready to continue imparting the education that you need to help you achieve your goals through our financial education that we get from the heart of our company, the OneAcademy. Today, our presenter is well knowledgeable and well equipped. His name is Mr. Alvin Morton. Mr. Morton joined One Life in April of 2017. As an educated miner, he completed levels 1 and 2 and became one of the earliest OneAcademy's presenters. He is an industrial engineering graduate from the University of the West Indies. He is the holder of an MBA from Heriot-Watt University and PMP from the Project Management Institute. On April 1st, 2020, he completed 9 years as a member of Toastmasters International. Alvin is married with 2 daughters and resides with his family in Lendor Village, Chaguanas. It is not the movement of the clock that produces the newness of life. It is the movement in your mind. This is one of Mr. Alvin's favorite quotes from Bishop T.D. Jakes. I now present to you Mr. Alvin Morton. Welcome to you, sir.
Very pleasant good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you are in this beautiful planet that we call Earth. I want to thank Sherry-Ann Charles Peterson for that very kind introduction and to welcome you to our session this day. In the words of one of my favorite presenters, Chris Cuomo from Cuomo Prime Time, let's get after it. We are going to be talking today about assets and liabilities. So I'm going to commence the business of sharing my screen. as well as all associated components therewith. Assets and liabilities. According to James A. Baldwin, most people find a disorientating mismatch between the long-term nature of their liabilities and the increasingly short-term nature of their assets. A very interesting quotation indeed. In this time of COVID-19, would you agree with this particular quotation? To the right, I challenge each of us to take a minute or so to look at these assets and liabilities that are shown on this very first slide and determine if we can fill this in and thus determine our net worth. Will it be indeed worthy, or will it be worth less? But with all of this, I'm also reminded it is also my responsibility to indicate this disclaimer. This information contained herein is general information. It's not designed to be a source of financial information, nor should it be construed as such. One Life is not an investment company. I encourage you, and I say this twice, please do your own due diligence. Please. You will find that it is of great benefit to you and to others who depend on you and perhaps who are not yet even born. Test.com, excuse me, assets equal liabilities plus equity. This is a very simple slide. Took a little bit of a departure from my normal approach today. So assets on your left, what you own. Liabilities in the middle, what you owe. And then equity, capital, profits, or losses, what you get. In other places, equity is also described as owner's equity or shareholder's equity. And from a personal perspective, it is considered net worth. I love this particular graphic from Robert Kiyosaki because I think it encapsulates very simply what assets are, what liabilities are, and how they relate to the group called poor, the group in the middle, no pun intended, called middle class, and the group to your right called rich. Cherian indicated that we should take copious notes if we wish to become wise and knowledgeable investors. The group to the right are wise, knowledgeable investors. Perhaps we would notice the extent of their assets column compared to their liabilities. Perhaps for the middle class, we noticed their assets column and how similar, if not very same, it is compared with the poor. Interestingly enough, there are more liabilities with the middle class than even the poor. Yet both of these have nothing left over to generate income in the form of rental, dividends, interest, or royalties. We would note that the expenses are different, but this is for another time. Look at the section at the bottom called balance sheet, assets and liabilities. If we were to compare ourselves against these three categories, where would we fit? And just to make the point a little more significantly, or more succinctly perhaps, the asset that you think you own, is it really yours? Look at the debtor's financial statement compared to the creditor's financial statement. Notice anything interesting? The creditor counts your liability as income, and that is registered in their balance sheet as an asset. We really need to understand the difference, lest we become confused. And finally, from Investopedia.com and at the level of a company, we hear companies talk about assets and liabilities and shareholders' equity. Some of us who are more sophisticated may own shares and have been to shareholder meetings. This very simple infographic tells it all. Assets, cash, inventory, property. Liabilities, rent, wages, utilities, taxes, loans. We can therefore understand why that thing called paycheck can never get us wealthy, because it is a liability to the company. And for them, if the shareholders' equity is to be large, the liabilities must be made smaller, if not small. But I want to bring in at this stage PhD Chris Martinson, who, from his series in Peak Prosperity, also gives a perspective on assets and liabilities. And I think we would find this most interesting. Let's listen in.
As we learned in the prior chapter on debt, the United States has an historic, never-before-seen level of debt on the books. Now, some would say that it's not reasonable to look only at debt. One also has to consider the assets and total liabilities to assess the situation. And they're right. After all, does it really matter if you have $1 million of debt if you also have no additional liabilities and assets worth $10 million? Well, not really, because your assets exceed your debts and liabilities. You should be $9 million in the clear. What we're going to do in this chapter is look at both the assets and the liabilities of the United States so that we can assess whether the current debt loads are worrisome or not. All right, let's begin here with assets. So what is an asset? One definition is items of ownership convertible into cash, total resources of a person or business as cash, notes, and accounts receivable, securities, inventories, goodwill, fixtures, machinery, or real estate. By this definition, an asset is something of value that can be converted into cash or provides access to or enhances a flow of cash. If we simply say assets are bank deposits, real estate, a stock or a bond, and the physical stuff we own, we'd pretty much cover the vast majority of what we consider to be our assets. A liability is a likely future expense for which one has an obligation to pay. Not just the absolute legal requirements to pay, which are the debts, but also any outstanding obligations. To make this understandable, for a family, their assets would be cash in the bank, home equity and other real estate held, and the things in their home that they owned. The family's debts would typically be in the form of a mortgage, an auto loan, credit card debt, and perhaps student loans. And the future liabilities of this family might include college educations for children that have not yet been fully saved for, or taking care of aging parents whose own resources are insufficient to cover their future needs. While debts are technically a type of liability, for the purposes of this chapter, when we refer to a debt, we're talking about a fixed commitment of a known amount. When we say liability, we're referring to a future obligation to pay that is neither fixed nor accurately known. We know that providing care for an aging parent will cost a lot of money, but not how much, because we don't know the duration of the expense or how much it will be in any given year. We're making this distinction between the term debt and liability because the media and even our government often treat the two very differently, something Congress reminds us of every time they say that Social Security and Medicare can be modified at any time and therefore don't count the same as our national debt. So, how does all this stack up in terms of our total net worth as a nation? To get a handle on the situation, we're going to look at the net worth of households, because on the public side of the story, as we saw earlier, the liabilities and assets of the federal and state governments really belong to the citizens. On the private side, the assets and liabilities of companies belong entirely to the bondholders and shareholders of the company, not the company itself. And who holds those bonds and stocks? Ultimately, somebody does, which for the most part means a private citizen does. Since we can pool citizens into households, we could examine household assets, deduct some relevant liabilities, and get a decent view of where things stand. The Federal Reserve tracks net worth at the household level, and this data is routinely and widely in the media. According to the Federal Reserve, household net worth exploded by more than $20 trillion between 2003 and 2008, an astonishing feat, before collapsing by $17 trillion during 2008 and 2009. And then again, between 2009 and 2013, the net worth of the countries increased again by nearly $20 trillion. To put those numbers in context, the entire net worth of the nation did not even hit $20 trillion until 1989. So the recent gyrations are akin to amassing and losing as much wealth as was accumulated during the first 300 years of history. And these are net assets, meaning debt has already been deducted. So the Federal Reserve and many in the media take the position that with just over $77 trillion in net worth, Americans are doing just fine, and our rapidly climbing national debt levels are no cause for concern. But before we get too excited about the astonishing wealth indicated here, there are two key oversights and a fallacy hidden in this report of which you should be aware. As always, the devil is in the details. Before I address those, I want you to observe this period here, spanning from 2000 to 2003. That dip in the net worth of households was due to the stock market collapse that ran from 2000 to 2003 and caused such great panic at the Federal Reserve that Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan lowered interest rates to the emergency level of 1%, thereby igniting the greatest of housing and credit bubbles in all of history. That led to an even bigger crisis in 2008 that wiped out even more wealth, in response to which interest rates were then lowered to 0%. Zero. As in, as low as mathematics will allow. Booms and busts and bubbles and bursts, that's how the Fed prefers to operate. These declines in total net worth lead to this observation. Debts are fixed. When you take on a debt, there it sits, growing larger and larger until and unless you make payments on it. Debts do not vary with general economic conditions or whether you get a raise or lose your job. Assets, on the other hand, are variable, sometimes gaining and sometimes losing value. And so this leads to the next key concept of the crash course. Debts are fixed, while assets are variable. Okay, where did the $18 trillion in new wealth since 2009 come from? Well, about 80% of that growth came from a rise in financial assets, and the remaining 20% came from a growth in real estate and other tangible assets. When we look closer at the actual amount of household net worth there is today, we see that 83% of the total net worth consists of financial assets, totaling about $63 trillion, while the tangible assets are the remaining 17% and total around $14 trillion. If we examine these assets a little more closely, we see that the $63 trillion worth of financial assets consists of things like pension funds, the assets of privately held businesses, deposits, stocks, bonds. The other bucket of $14 trillion in tangible assets consists primarily of real estate, which is 69% of this bucket, and consumer durables, which would be your car, your dryer, and if you live in New England like I do, maybe your snowblower, if you've got one. For every single one of these assets except cash, in order to liberate the wealth from these assets, you'd have to sell them first. One general rule of asset markets is this: things go up in price when there are more buyers than sellers, and things go down in price when there are more sellers than buyers. Hold on to that thought for when we get to the chapter covering demographics. Now let me expose two great oversights of this household wealth report. The first oversight I wish to illuminate is that the data is presented as if it applied to our entire country in a fairly even and therefore useful manner. It does not. As of 2010, the top 1% owned 35% of all net household wealth, and looking at stocks only, owns 42% of all the country's financial wealth. If you can't see it, I apologize. The top 1% is represented by a very thin green smear at the top of the column there. So it's great that our stock market keeps powering higher and higher, but for every $1 trillion it goes up, $420 billion of that newly created wealth goes to only 1 out of 100 households. The top 20%, which includes the top 1%, owns nearly 89% of all net household wealth and over 95% of all financial wealth in the U.S. This means the bottom 80% of the citizens of the United States, represented in yellow, holds only 11% of the total wealth of this country and less than 5% of its financial wealth. And even within the remaining 80%, the distribution of wealth is similarly weighted nearly all towards the top. Oh, but wait a moment. The top 1% isn't hogging everything. If we look at debt, we see that the top 1% only holds 6% of the country's debt. The next 9% owns 22% of it, but the bottom 90%, that's 9 out of every 10 people in the U.S., holds 73% of America's debt. So the rich hold almost all the wealth, but generously allowed the rest of us to hold on to all the debt. Given this tremendous disparity, I'm reminded that Plutarch once cautioned that an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. More immediately, this helps us understand why the great credit crisis of 2008 was worse than expected. Just as was true of the wealth gap in the late 1920s before the onset of the Great Depression, the severity of a crisis does not depend on average wealth, but the distribution of wealth too. If a large swath of the population lacks the means to weather the storm, then the storm will be longer and harsher than otherwise would be the case. So, what does it mean that 80% of our population possesses a meager 11% of the total wealth and the lion's share of the debt? For one thing, it means that the recent efforts by the Fed to provide massive amounts of liquidity to support the biggest and wealthiest banks at the inflationary expense of the lower classes were not only misguided potentially, but cruel and unusual. And this leads to an easy prediction to make. The wealth gap in the U.S. will hamper our recovery and deepen the downturns. The second and bigger oversight is that the Fed mysteriously does not offset the net worth of the nation by the general liabilities of the federal and state governments or private corporations. Wouldn't it make sense for the Fed to offset these against household wealth? To me it does. So let's look at these under and even unfunded liabilities. What we're going to look at here are pension, retirement, and entitlement programs. At the state and municipal levels, we find that pensions are underfunded to the tune of maybe $4 trillion. What this means is that as money was taken in through taxes, states and municipalities actively chose to spend that money elsewhere in preference to putting it into pension funds. Big promises and insufficient contributions were made at the same time. And what does it mean when we say the state and municipal pensions are underfunded by $4 trillion? How's that calculated? The $4 trillion shortfall is what's called a net present value, or NPV amount. Now, this is important, so let's take a quick peek into this idea. A net present value calculation adds up all the cash inflows, in this hypothetical example, $1,000 per year for 6 years, and offsets or nets those inflows against all future cash outflows. Since $1 today is worth more than $1 in the future cash flows have to be discounted and brought back to the present. So we net all the cash inflows and outflows, discount them back to the present to determine if the thing we are measuring has a positive or negative value. Net present value. This is the methodology used to calculate the status of state and municipal pension funds and the U.S. entitlement program shortfalls. Now, growth in the value of the pension fund assets plus future taxes are offset against cash outlays to pensioners, brought back to the present to indicate that in order for pension funds simply to have zero value, $4 trillion would today have to be placed in those state funds. An important realization about NPV calculations is that the future has already been largely taken into account. So, waiting and hoping for a different future result to emerge pretty much never works. If we had to place $4 trillion in the funds today, but don't do this, next year the shortfall number will be even larger.
I trust that this excerpt, because I'm not able to play the entire video, maybe in another session we will be able so to do, gives a flavor of not just assets and liabilities at the level of the individual, at the level of the household, at the level of a country. I hope this gives us some ideas to the relationships that exist between this, debt, interest rates. Some of us are going to be relying on pension funds and the level of percentage that that occupies in terms of financial assets. And what we ourselves in this journey that we're on through the OneAcademy and through One Life are seeking to invest in. Our OneAcademy does have a few things to say. It mentions the word assets on 97 occasions in the Level 1 manual. I am not able to articulate all of them, but I have chosen to pick out a few. Page 6, one should strive as much as he or she can to diversify the assets invested in. Page 8, some assets manage to keep their value stable and even to become more expensive over time. We may recall on the video certain assets which continue to increase, and what the top 1% puts that initial money that they get through seniorage, which was covered in an earlier section and an earlier session, and how that benefits them because of the Cantillon effect. They get it first. Page 9. For various reasons, some people have a resentment towards gold, which incidentally is one of the assets that tends to keep its value and even becomes more expensive over time, and prefer to put their money in asset or assets outside the realm of precious metals. Page 18. The general idea is that you have to achieve a good balance of asset yields in your portfolio. We would remember that Chris Martinson said assets are variable. Debts, and by extension liabilities, are not, and in fact tend to increase when interest is considered. And of course, page 21, individual assets experience ups and downs. So we see a large measure of agreement, if not reinforcement, as it relates to the importance of assets and why we should get on board this stream. And going back to initial slides, where we saw the balance sheet of the poor, the middle class, and the rich, I trust we can see now some of these important, if not immediately obvious, connections. Liabilities. Level 1 manual is silent on this word. However, the Level 2 manual mentions the word 16 times. We should have 6 times more assets than liabilities, you think? That's a question. Perhaps we can discuss that at another point in time. And just to choose one of the 16, the definition according to our OneAcademy of liability, the money a company owed to another and that is supposed to be covered by assets. Don't we know, haven't we heard, that our currencies are not covered by assets? Yet we have countries with debt to GDP ratios, and the debt is a form of liability that exceeds what its total production is as a country. And yet there are no assets to back that up. Some key takeaways. If assets are greater than liabilities, this is okay. Example, 10 million in assets versus 1 million in liabilities. An asset, something that can be converted to something of value. We should pay attention to the one because it can be converted to something of value and not necessarily cash. Because no longer, especially after COVID-19 and some of the stimuli packages that are being bandied about, if not implemented already, no longer will cash continue to be king. A liability, a future expense that is an obligation to pay. It is known not in fixed or accurate terms. That is duration or quantity. That's just something to consider, especially for those of us with young children who may not wish to study in their native countries or may yet wish to study something for which there is yet to be determined a price and a duration thereof. Assets, items of ownership convertible to cash. Then Chris Martinson gave a very detailed definition of assets: cash, notes, accounts receivable, securities, inventories, and the like. This can help us understand why certain companies wish to reopen quickly within the context of COVID-19. because they may have inventories that have short shelf lives. And this means that those inventories will become assets that decline in value. And if they are not insured, will result in a loss of value, a loss of net worth. An important quote from Plutarch: an imbalance between rich and poor. And we can see from one of our early slides why that imbalance exists. It has to do with the assets and liabilities column. An imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. Is this true of the jurisdiction to which you belong? Debts minus liabilities, liabilities are fixed commitments of known amounts. So a debt is a form of liability. We know what it is, we know when it's due. In some jurisdictions, the financial institutions have delayed or deferred some of these liabilities. All that means is that they've extended the time. What have you, what have we done with this breathing room? Have we chosen to redirect some of those funds to reduce some other liabilities, perhaps? Net worth: assets minus debts minus other liabilities. It is unclear why some jurisdictions, Ms. Martinson mentions the US government, chooses to ignore other liabilities. Pensions underfunded by approximately US $4 trillion at the time of the video. Is this underfunding true in your country or jurisdiction, or perhaps our own personal affairs? And then an interesting thing: the lowering of interest rates occurring at the same time as a dip in household net worth. As we come to the end of today's session, some terms that I encourage each of us to Google and do our own due diligence on, please. Assets, liabilities, owner's equity, and net worth. Get to information sessions and or get into the level 1 of the OneAcademy. Because the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. That which is delayed is not denied. Have a super fabulous day, everyone, and continue to stay safe as the world progresses through various phases of the reopening exercise. Let us reopen our minds also within the context of the information shared today, as well as the insight we will continue to gain as we progress towards tomorrow. I now turn control back over to our most gracious host, Sherry Ann Peterson.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Alvin Morton. Wow, we truly appreciate such information. We thank you very much for all that you have done today, your extensive research, and the valuable information. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate it. Our OneAcademy Financial Education provides you with valuable information that is spent at tangible and physical universities. You have the liberty of this information through our OneAcademy by just logging in with us every weekday except on a Wednesday at 12 noon, so that you would become very knowledgeable and wise business leaders. I leave you today with something that was sent from one of our diamond leaders in our chat today. I borrow these words: your competition isn't other people. Your competition is your procrastination, your ego, your unhealthy food you're consuming, the knowledge you neglect, the negative behavior you're nurturing, and your lack of creativity. Compete against that. One thing from this quote I must say: those of you who were on this call or will be listening to us on Facebook Live, you have conquered one thing. You have not neglected knowledge. And I congratulate you for being with us today. I congratulate you if you will be listening to this live. I congratulate you. Today was such an extraordinary day and left a question in my mind that was expressed through Mr. Morton's presentation. Is my asset really mine? That's a question I leave you to ponder on. Folks, friends, thank you again for joining us. I look forward to being with you again tomorrow. I wish all of you a blessed day. Goodbye.
Just tomorrow, please God, folks, we will probably not be on live. So the next time you will see us would be on Thursday. We have we have an engagement tomorrow, the team, and therefore we will see us live on Thursday next.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Muriel. That is very true.
Thank
Blessings,
you,
everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.